In this video, I'm going to explain to you why austerity is necessary when a country has a deficit, and why we have these men, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, to blame for the situation we find ourselves in. First of all, let's discuss the current situation. At the time of the March 2018 budget, the UK national debt is estimated to be 1.78 trillion. As with any debt, there is interest to pay, and the amount the government spends on interest is around 39 billion every year. That figure excludes interest payment paid to the Bank of England, which is state-owned. Nonetheless, that is still 39 billion not going into our public services. Then we have the deficit, which is the difference between what the government receives in tax revenue and the total amount it pays out to public services and other expenditure. Ever since 2010, when the Conservatives entered government, there has been an effort to bring down the deficit so public spending is more in line with what it brings in. Now, the government have some choices on how to respond and correct a deficit. There are plenty of economic theories which advocate different approaches to fiscal policy in order to correct the deficit. Some are more risky than others. The approach the Conservative-led governments have taken since 2010 is probably the least risky option that they could have taken. Bringing public spending down gradually and relatively minor changes to tax rates to increase revenue without harming consumer spending. An example of this would be the VAT increase, which went from 17.5% to 20%. That additional 2.5% is unlikely to stop anyone from buying a new TV. The policy of raising income tax threshold is, in my view, probably the best fiscal policy decision the government could have taken. By lowering the tax rate threshold, everyone is getting a tax cut, leaving more money in everyone's pocket to spend and boost the economy. In theory. But it's also the people at the very bottom of the pay scale who benefit most from this policy. But I digress. So, how did this all come about? Why was austerity needed? Well, we need to take a look back at what the Labour Party did between 1997 and 2008. Between 1992 and 2007, the UK experienced economic growth every year. As the economy grows, tax revenue rises with it. Gordon Brown said on several occasions that the country would not return to boom and bust. So arrogant was his belief that throughout their time in government, every time the tax take rose, the Labour government committed to spend it. They never for one moment thought a bust was coming. And when it did in 2008, and the tax take dropped, they had to borrow in order to make up the shortfall. They made no allowance whatsoever that there could have been a downturn in the economy. Or in other words, they didn't save for a rainy day. With the debt being taken out, there is then interest that now needs to be paid on that debt, which is money not going to public services. So you then need to borrow more in order to cover your spending commitments and pay interest on the debt, which of course makes the debt rise and the debt interest payments bigger. It's a vicious circle. It was a monstrous error by the Labour government, and we have been suffering with the results ever since, and will likely to do so for several years more in the future. The Conservatives are now charged with cleaning up this horrific mess left by Labour. And cutting public spending is an exceptionally difficult and unpopular. Unfortunately, it is the best way to get out of the debt cycle the country is currently in. We then turn our attention to the absolute shambles that is the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, who advocates ending austerity. Now, there is an economic argument that advocates higher state spending in order to grow the economy. However, this approach is high risk. Probably the best example of this happening is during the 1930s Depression in the United States, The government there poured millions into the New Deal and undertook huge infrastructure projects in order to get their citizens back to work. Unfortunately, the New Deal didn't work, and the US found itself back in recession straight after. If we follow the same course in this country, if the UK follows that path and decides to spend its way out of its debt problem, and it doesn't work, this will of course lead to the debt levels rising and debt interest payment rising with it. Interest paid to service this debt is not money being spent on public service. This basic point is critical. If Labour get into power, they will sell our children's future down the river, and they will never benefit from the public services we enjoy today. All the taxes they pay will end up going on state interest. Labour seem to believe that they can tax the very top in society and that will pay for everything. Unfortunately, once again, history has shown that doesn't work. The rich are able to move their money around where they want, and if necessary move it out the country. This is exactly what happened in France when President Hollande introduced his 75% tax rate on incomes over €1 million. The vast majority of the wealthy within the country quite simply moved north to London. And not only did the French people lose out on the wealth tax income, they lost out on the income tax those individuals would have paid otherwise. So this once again shows that taxing the rich just doesn't work, and can often leave the country worse off because of it. This is why Jeremy Corbyn's plan and last manifesto is utter nonsense. None of his points are deliverable, because the means in which they intend to raise money won't work, and are more likely to reduce the amount of revenue the country will get. And in turn, up goes the debt and the debt interest payment. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll look forward to speaking to you next time.